Have you ever felt someone lean in and then, almost the moment it started to matter, felt them step back? The messages slow down, the warmth cools, there's a distance you can't quite name, and you're left replaying the last conversation, searching for the moment you must have gotten it wrong. I want you to sit with that feeling for a second, because it's one of the most common misreadings we make in relationships. When someone pulls away, we almost automatically turn it into a verdict on us. What did I do? Was I too much? Did I want this more than they did? Sometimes that's the right question. But often, it isn't the whole story. Sometimes it isn't about you at all. Sometimes getting close to another person activates something old and protective in them. A habit of pulling back the moment connection starts to feel real, even while part of them genuinely wants it. That contradiction is worth understanding, because if you don't see it, you'll spend a huge amount of energy trying to decode someone else's every silence and mood shift, and lose touch with your own signals in the process. Let me be clear about something first. Not everyone who withdraws is working through some deep fear of intimacy. Sometimes a person pulls away because they've simply lost interest, or realized you're not compatible, or decided they don't want what you're offering. We shouldn't romanticize every disappearance into a secret sign of buried feeling, but there is a real pattern in some people where closeness itself triggers discomfort. They want to be close. They also feel exposed by it. They crave being understood and then flinch when someone actually starts to understand them. They enjoy intimacy and then feel an almost automatic pull to restore distance once they have it. Where does that come from? It usually comes from what a person has learned over years about what happens when they need someone. If vulnerability was met with disappointment often enough, if depending on someone taught them that dependence is where you get hurt, the mind doesn't usually sit down and form a conscious belief about it. It builds a quieter set of expectations instead. I can handle this myself. I shouldn't need too much. If I let someone in, they'll eventually have the power to let me down. Independence for that person stops being just a preference and becomes a kind of armor. And after enough years wearing it, the armor starts to feel like identity. They'll say, I'm just independent, or I don't really need much from people. And some of that might be perfectly true. Independence on its own isn't a problem. The real question is whether it's something they've chosen or something they reach for automatically whenever vulnerability shows up. There's a real difference between the two. Healthy independence sounds like, I can stand on my own and I can also let someone in. Defensive independence sounds like, I can stand on my own, so I must never really need anyone. The second version is rigid in a way the first isn't, and it tends to crack under exactly the situation it was built to prevent. A relationship that starts to matter. Think about how this usually unfolds. At first, a new connection feels easy precisely because nothing is at stake yet. It's curiosity, attraction, conversation, low pressure, low risk. But then something shifts. You start to matter to them. They start caring what you think. They start telling you things they usually keep to themselves. And now, without either of you announcing it, there's something to lose. That's the moment closeness stops being simple. You might experience the growing bond as reassuring finally, something real. They might experience that same bond as exposing finally, something that can hurt. You move toward it because it feels safer. They move away because it feels riskier. And neither of you necessarily understands why the other is reacting the way they are. This is how the chase and retreat cycle gets started. Picture a few weeks of genuinely getting closer to someone. The conversations go deeper. They tell you something they rarely tell anyone. You start to feel like this might be becoming something real. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, the energy changes. Messages get shorter. They stop reaching out first. They seem distracted or distant. And you have no idea why. So your attention turns inward, but in the wrong direction. You start combing back through your last few interactions, looking for the mistake you must have made. And the more anxious that search makes you, the more you want to close the gap. You send another message. You ask if everything's okay. You want reassurance. From where you're standing, that makes complete sense. You're trying to repair the connection. But from where they're standing, your reaching out might land as more pressure, arriving at the exact moment they already feel overwhelmed by how close things have gotten. Here's what's actually happening underneath. Your nervous system is saying, come closer. I need to know this is still okay. Theirs is saying, give me space. I need to feel safe again. And the more one person moves toward the other, the more the other moves away. Neither is entirely wrong. Both are reacting to fear, just different fears, aimed in different directions. Once you can see that, the question, who's at fault here, stops being the useful one. A better question is, what's actually happening emotionally between the two of us right now? Something similar happens with inconsistency. You may know someone who is warm and fully present one day, asking questions, remembering small details, making you feel like the only person in the room and then unreachable the next. Your mind wants to pick one version and call it the real one. Was the warmth fake? Is the distance fake? Often, neither is. The warmth can be genuine connection. The distance can be genuine discomfort with vulnerability. Both things can be true about the same person in the same week, which is exactly why understanding someone takes more than noticing what they feel. It takes understanding how what they feel gets translated or mistranslated into behavior. Someone can care about you and still act defensively. They can want closeness and still lack, right now, the capacity to sustain it. And here's a distinction worth holding on to. Understanding why someone behaves a certain way is not the same as excusing the effect it has on you. You can have real empathy for someone's history and still not make that history your responsibility to manage. Their intent and their impact are two separate things. They may not be trying to hurt you at all, they may simply be protecting themselves the only way they know how. But if that protection keeps leaving you anxious and confused, the impact on you is still real and it still matters. This is where self-awareness becomes the more useful skill, more useful, honestly, than getting better at reading the other person. Instead of asking over and over what's going on inside them, try asking what's going on inside you. What do you feel when they go quiet? Fear? Anger? Shame? A sudden urge to prove you're worth staying for? And then notice what you do with that feeling. Do you send another message? Do you become more agreeable? Quieter about your own needs, careful not to ask for too much. Do you start quietly tracking their mood the way you'd track weather? That noticing is emotional intelligence in practice, not knowing the right vocabulary for it. But catching the moment an emotion starts steering your behavior before you've consciously chosen anything. Because there's a real risk in getting pulled into constant interpretation. Why did they take so long to respond? Why were they so open yesterday and so far away today? What did that message actually mean? Eventually, your attention gets trapped entirely inside the relationship, and you're no longer living it, you're monitoring it. And the more you monitor uncertainty, the louder that uncertainty becomes. Whatever you keep your attention fixed on tends to grow in your mind. If all your attention is locked onto someone else's availability, your own inner signals get harder and harder to hear. You stop noticing what you need because you're too busy tracking what they're doing. That's a quiet form of losing yourself. There's another pattern worth naming, an invisible ceiling on how close someone will let you get. They'll talk deeply, share things most people never hear from them, show you a side of themselves they usually keep hidden. And then, right around a certain level of closeness, something shifts. They get distracted. They joke it off. They suddenly have somewhere else to be. You can almost feel a door swinging shut, and you wonder why they opened it in the first place if they were only going to close it again. But the opening was probably real. The complication is that wanting closeness and being able to tolerate closeness aren't the same skill. A person can sincerely want love and still struggle with what a close relationship actually demands emotionally. They can be afraid of losing you and still be the one pushing you away. People are rarely as tidy as the labels we put on them. You'll also notice that some people show care more comfortably through action than through words. They remember something you mentioned weeks ago. They check that you got home safely. They quietly show up when something practical needs handling. Those gestures can be genuine, and for some people, doing something feels far safer than saying something vulnerable out loud. But a single caring gesture isn't proof of a whole commitment. Look for the pattern over time, not the isolated moment. One of the hardest sequences to make sense of is what happens after real vulnerability. Someone who usually keeps everything private suddenly opens up late at night, unusually honest, telling you something painful they rarely share. For a moment, you feel closer than you've ever been. And then the next day, they're distant, almost formal, acting like the conversation never happened. That can feel like whiplash, because you read the vulnerability as progress. It may well have been. But vulnerability can also create a sudden sense of exposure, a feeling of, now they know something about me. And if someone has learned to associate being known with being at risk, their mind may respond by pulling the distance back into place. The very moment that created closeness becomes the moment that triggers retreat. This is exactly where chasing tends to backfire. If someone is pulling away because they feel overwhelmed, meeting that with more pursuit rarely restores safety, it usually adds pressure. It's more useful to give yourself some room and simply watch what happens next. Do they come back? Do they say anything about what happened? Do they take any responsibility for the whiplash or pretend it didn't occur? Those answers tell you far more than trying to guess what's going on privately in their head. Conflict tends to follow the same logic. Some people move toward repair. When tension shows up, they want to talk it through. They want reassurance the relationship is still intact. Others experience conflict as pure overload and shut down, go quiet, need time alone. Needing space isn't automatically a red flag. Regulating yourself before a hard conversation is often healthy. The real distinction is between taking space and avoiding responsibility. Healthy space eventually leads back to the conversation. Avoidance just delays the same conflict until it resurfaces later, unchanged. A relationship doesn't become safe just because someone eventually comes back after disappearing. What matters is what they do once they're back. Do they actually listen? Do they acknowledge what you went through while they were gone? Do they take responsibility or try to understand what set them off? Repair isn't just reconnecting, it's learning something and doing it differently next time. This is also part of why commitment specifically can feel so threatening to someone with a strong avoidant pattern. As long as a relationship stays undefined, the emotional risk feels containable. Commitment raises the stakes. Now there's a future involved. Now someone else's needs are part of your decisions. If a person has come to equate depending on someone with losing their freedom, commitment can trigger real anxiety. That explanation is worth understanding. It's not a reason to accept indefinite ambiguity. You're allowed to want clarity about what relationship you're actually in. You're allowed to have your needs treated as legitimate, not as something you should be grateful to have met occasionally. People do change. Attachment patterns aren't fixed for life. People can become more self-aware, more able to stay present when closeness gets uncomfortable, better at communicating instead of vanishing. But there's one thing you cannot do. You cannot do that internal work for someone else. You can be supportive, communicate clearly, hold a respectful space for them to grow into. You cannot love someone into being emotionally ready. This is where a lot of people get stuck, not on what's actually happening, but on potential. You see who they are underneath the defenses. You remember the nights they opened up completely. You start picturing what this could become once they finally feel safe enough. And slowly, without quite noticing, you start evaluating a future that hasn't happened instead of the relationship that's actually in front of you right now. If you're not careful, adjusting to someone else's emotional limits will quietly reshape you. You get careful with your words. You stop bringing up certain things. You start reading their mood before you decide what you're allowed to feel. Eventually, the question shifts from what do I need to what can I do so they don't leave. That shift is worth noticing the moment it happens, because understanding another person should never require abandoning yourself. If keeping a relationship functioning means constantly shrinking your own needs, that relationship is costing you something real, whether or not it feels that way day to day. And if you already carry some fear of abandonment, this cycle can be especially gripping. Their distance creates anxiety, their return brings relief, and because the warmth arrives unpredictably, it can start to feel more valuable than it would if it were simply steady. You can end up attached not just to the person, but to the whole cycle of losing and regaining them. If that sounds familiar, it isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to get curious about. What is this pattern doing to your attention? What is it doing to your ability to regulate your own emotions? Are you responding to the relationship or mostly responding to the fear of losing it? And underneath all of that, one more honest question. Is this relationship actually good for me? Even people with a fairly secure emotional style get worn down by enough inconsistency. Being secure doesn't mean tolerating unlimited uncertainty. It means recognizing that real connection needs mutual effort, honesty, availability, and repair, and being willing to say so when those things are consistently missing. If someone is genuinely becoming more secure, you'll usually see it in what they do, not just what they say. They get more honest about when they're pulling away instead of hiding it. They come back to hard conversations instead of avoiding them permanently. They let you closer without immediately manufacturing distance. They start taking responsibility for their own pattern instead of leaving you to manage it. That's what real growth looks like, not one big emotional breakthrough, not a promise that everything's different now, but movement, shorter retreats, clearer communication, less fear around vulnerability and commitment, more ability to simply stay. But don't mistake inconsistency for progress just because you badly want this to work. Sometimes what we call patience is really self-abandonment wearing a nicer name. Sometimes what we call potential is just a pattern we've decided to keep excusing. Look at direction, not isolated good moments. Where is this actually going? Over time, not this week, not after one honest conversation, but across months. In the end, you don't need to become an expert at decoding someone else's every mood and silence. You need to get better at hearing yourself. Notice what fear does to your attention. Notice when a feeling gets treated as a fact. Someone's silence might make you feel rejected. That doesn't automatically mean you were rejected. Someone's distance might make you feel unlovable. That isn't a measurement of your worth. It's a reflection of what they're currently able to offer. You can feel the fear without obeying it. You can notice the urge to chase without acting on it immediately. You can understand someone's wounds without inheriting them as your own responsibility. You can hold empathy for another person and still hold your own boundaries. At the same time, those two things were never actually in competition. You can understand why someone pulls away and still decide that a relationship built on constant withdrawal isn't one you want to keep choosing. You can forgive someone and still create distance. You can care about someone deeply and still choose yourself. None of that is cruelty. It's what emotional maturity actually looks like in practice, because the real question was never just whether someone has feelings for you. It's whether they can actually show up inside a relationship with those feelings, whether they can communicate, stay present, tolerate being known, repair after conflict, and make room for what you need too. Feelings that stay locked inside someone's private inner world might be completely real and still leave the person on the other end of them lonely. So if someone pulls away right as things start to mean something, resist the pull to make yourself the whole explanation. Don't assume you were too much. Don't assume you weren't enough. And don't quietly convince yourself their disappearing is secret proof that they love you. Pause instead. Get curious about what's actually happening between you. And just as importantly, pay attention to what's happening inside you while it does, whether you're staying yourself in this or slowly becoming smaller to keep it alive. Because clarity, most of the time, doesn't arrive the moment you finally figure someone else out. It arrives the moment you get quiet enough to hear yourself again.